Welcome everyone to the Business and Nature webinar series, which is being launched by Salesforce in partnership with ourselves here at Wonderoom. We're thrilled to have you join us here for episode 1. The purpose of the Business and Nature webinar series is a 5-part webinar series running from today through to January, where we'll be covering the biggest topics for business on nature. And really the intention is to provide clarity and insights for businesses across different sectors and geographies on these biggest topics shaping the business agenda on nature, to bring forward pioneering business leaders and nature experts who will be sharing their perspectives and expertise, and to provide the opportunity for you to share your own views and perspectives and to connect and interact with other businesses and community around the world on this really important subject. Really now is a moment for business to engage more on nature, and Salesforce and ourselves are so thrilled to have you join us here today for episode 1. So I think we will move to the agenda slide if we can, Vishnavi, thank you. So for the benefits of building a nature strategy for business, episode 1, I will start by sharing some context and sort of overview of the sort of question and the space. And then we will move to a panel discussion where we have each of our panelists, that's Tim from Salesforce, we have Christina from IKEA, Marcelo from Natura&Co, and Marissa, excuse me, from L'Oreal, joining us. And actually each of them are going to share their own learnings and insights from their own nature journey in an open way. And we are then going to actually move to a Q&A, an audience Q&A with all the panelists, which I will help to moderate, where it's an opportunity to bring your burning questions forward and sort of gain insights from across the panel. What we would suggest in terms of interaction with all of us on here today, we're really keen to hear your thoughts, comments, and questions. So what we'd like to propose is that there's 2 functions that we have here. We have the chat box and we have the Q&A box. We would really welcome you to add your questions really from now onwards as we go into the Q&A box. So any questions you want answered in the interactive Q&A section, do add them as we go and as they occur to you. And then for the chat box, if you have any other sort of broader reflections or thoughts, please do add them into the chat box. And that's how we'll be approaching it for today. And then we'll close the session with some top tips and resources to help you navigate your nature journey. So on to the next slide, Vishnavi, thanks. By way of a brief introduction, I'm Mairead, the founder of Wonderoom, and we launched the Greenhouse by Wonderoom as a space in which we help brands and businesses to create and communicate nature positive impact. And our perspective on this actually is that nature is a growth opportunity for business, whether that's growing nature restoration or growing regenerative business, growing customer engagement, or growing team learning. It is a way for business to move beyond risk and cost into value creation. And at the heart of that is the belief in collaboration, and that actually nature requires collaboration by business with other businesses and with broader stakeholders, communities, and across the ecosystem. And that's very much reflected here today for all of us coming together as businesses across different sectors and geographies. All of this begins with having the right strategy, which is our theme for today. So if we can move on to the next slide. This probably won't be new news to people joining today for this webinar, but it's fair to say that corporate action on nature still does lag behind climate, as seen by the fact that only about 5% of companies have committed to targets for biodiversity loss versus 83% on climate change. That is changing, and we are seeing nature rising up the corporate agenda, however, and as reflected by a lot of the activity at New York Climate Week just in the last couple of weeks. And that's really a recognition of the interdependency of nature with climate, but also beyond that, the interdependency with broader business resilience too, and the health of people and planet. We are seeing a lot more sort of clearer policy signals and momentum building And that's also being reflected in an increasing shift from more voluntary to more mandatory standards and initiatives that are impacting business. And of course, we saw the TNFD recent launch as well, which has been brilliant to see. We would also say that beyond risk, working with nature really does present opportunities for value creation and impact for business. And that's certainly something we're going to be hearing from the panel today. If we can move forward, Vaishnavi. Just as a quick scene setter, and it's the final slide we'll share actually before diving into our panelists. But if we were to say, sort of to shape the space a little bit, what are the key benefits of building a nature strategy for business? They're really quite diverse and really value adding. So of course, there's the fact that it can help to achieve net zero and biodiversity goals, but it can also really help to manage supply chain risks, protect critical resources, and help build business resilience overall. There's obviously the piece around getting ahead of nature-related regulation. And then there's the piece on the community side of really supporting local communities and Indigenous peoples and generating economic opportunities through that. The last couple are interesting also because it's around the fact that it's actually an opportunity to create new and enhanced products, services, and materials. And we're definitely going to hear a couple of really strong examples of that today through the panel. And lastly, nature is so visceral, it's so tangible, it's something that everyone connects with, and so is just such a powerful opportunity to engage people, engage customers, teams, and investors. And so with that, we're going to pass to our first panelist, Tim Christophersen, Vice President, Climate Action at Salesforce. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Mairead, and welcome to everybody. And also a big thank you to Christina, Marissa, and Marcelo from our side here at Salesforce. It takes courage to be a trailblazer in this space because there's still a lot we don't know about nature, but we know enough to take action. And we definitely know that business has to play a key role to achieve the global biodiversity framework. Early in my career, I spent a lot of time explaining to businesses what biodiversity is. This was over 20 years ago, working for IUCN. And I contrast that with standing room only in Montreal at the CBD when the Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted. And in the morning business briefings, the room was packed with businesses that wanted to know more about this. So there's a big surge of interest. And in this webinar series, we'll hopefully explain a little bit about what we learned. The key lesson, to summarize it in 2 words, would be don't wait, engage now, because nature needs our support. We need nature even more than nature needs us. So if you go to the next slide, please. The reason for Salesforce to engage deeply in this topic is mostly because of climate change. It is not only because of climate change, but for us, we have a very strong emission reductions target of 50% by 2030. And in parallel, we need to invest more in nature for both mitigation and adaptation. We clearly see that there is a link between the nature and the climate agenda. We have now the global biodiversity framework. We have within that clear goals for business. There is regulation coming, both in the EU and expected in other jurisdictions. So there's something that businesses will have to tackle. And within that, we have chosen, when we launched our Nature Positive strategy in April of this year, to tag it onto our climate action plan. For us, climate action is nature action. Nature action is climate action. Obviously, acting on nature is not alone enough to save the climate. We also need emission reductions as a priority. But nature has a key role to play to reach the climate targets as well, and all the other SDGs. We also look to our staff when we take nature action, because for many of them, whether it's wildfires in California, where our headquarters is based, or floods or droughts, nature increasingly plays a role in the health and well-being of our staff. And we can use nature to build resilience in the cities where we are based, in the cities where most of our employees are. And all of that is part of our Nature Positive strategy, which I'll now briefly introduce and then few of the key lessons before we move on to the other panelists. So this is our nature positive strategy in one slide. It's actually a longish PDF document that you're welcome to download from our website that also includes a lot more detail, but this is the summary of our strategy with all its commitments. We are not committing to become a nature positive business because nature positive needs an all of society effort between governments, private sector, businesses. So we can contribute to a nature positive world, and we will do what we can to achieve that all of society goal. To that end, we've committed to 3 pillars of our strategy. We want to reduce our nature impacts, so do our homework at home. We've done a TNFD impact and dependencies assessment and are now doing a second level of assessment that goes deeper into our own nature impacts, but also looking into our dependencies as a business. In the technology sector, that is mostly related to the freshwater use from data centers, but there are also other impacts that we can reduce. The second pillar is about leading on nature restoration at scale. And here we work with the 1 Trillion Trees initiative, 1T.org, that has now been joined by 90 companies to conserve and restore the world's forest ecosystems, which are essential not only for the climate, but also are home to 80% of terrestrial biodiversity. So they are essential for our nature goals. Our third pillar, and perhaps the biggest lever that we have as Salesforce with about 200,000 customers worldwide, we want to accelerate customer success and the nature positive movement. Now, what does that mean? There are thousands of our customers whom we have a trusted relationship with and who will have to tackle nature as a topic. They will have to wrap their heads around it. We want to help them to do that with things like this webinar series, but also with tools that can make it cheaper and more robust and exact to measure their nature footprint, to identify where to take nature actions, and to help them also channel the right investments. We've also linked a couple of commitments to our nature positive strategy. So by 2025, we will have a plan to measure and manage our own impacts and dependencies. That is in progress. We've committed to buy at least 1 million tons of high quality blue carbon credits, mostly from mangroves. And we've been instrumental in launching the Global Mangrove Breakthrough this year, a coordinated effort with many, many other companies and governments and NGOs to conserve and restore 15 million hectares of additional mangroves worldwide. That's a $4 billion collective effort. We want to support and mobilize the conservation, restoration, and growth of 100 million trees. That is our own commitment under the Trillion Trees initiative. And we've made available $100 million ecosystem restoration and climate justice grant fund to also ensure there are ecopreneurs moving into the space. There are NGOs, there are scientists who can develop the right enabling conditions for all of us. So this took a couple of months to develop, and in a way, designing a solid strategy is the easy part. We're now moving to implementation, which is of course more difficult, but we clearly recommend to have a very solid strategy based on a TNFD assessment, that's the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and to follow this evolving guidance from other bodies as you move forward, but not to wait. We can get started now, and it's always possible to ask peers like we have today on this panel. There are great outfits like Business for Nature that I recommend anybody who thinks about joining this space to join as a network. There's about 1,100 companies. We are in Business for Nature, exchanging experiences. Green Biz in the US is launching for the first time a nature-only networking event in October. Bloom in San Jose. So there are many spaces and places and people where you can get help. So with that, back over to you, Mairead, and looking forward to hearing from our other panelists and to questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Tim, for sharing that. And we will be coming to more questions for Tim as part of the Q&A. So if we can now, Vaishnavi, move to the next slide to introduce our second panelist, which is Christina Ström, Head of Sustainability Supply and Strategic Sustainability Assignments at IKEA. Welcome, Christina. Over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, and such a great thing that we're actually doing these things where we go across industries and different brands to talk about these important things. I think the learning is already such a good start in when you want to build your nature strategy. So if you go to the next page there, Vaishnavi. I think that for IKEA to understand what it is that we have in front of us and what we have also been doing, it's good to look into our value chain. How does it look like? And if we start in the listen and learn, just to say this, of course, where we talk to our customers, where we have dialogues of what we have here with our suppliers and partners to learn what is out there, what is the wish for the future, and how can we do things in a much better way. And then we move in this circle to the right, where we have the possibility in IKEA, of course, we design and create our own furniture and our own home furnishing accessories and the food offer. So of course here we can also choose what kind of material do we then use, or what kind of food ingredients do we use. And we are in very much need of a diversity and a variety of these to not have a very boring offer, so to say, and also good tasting food, etc. So of course you can already see here that nature is so important for us. And then we move into the next part, and that is to manufacture anything that we have then developed. And there's, of course, where we have a lot of our impacts and dependencies are happening there along the supply chain and backward all the way to the raw material source. So here we need to then see that we're also doing every right decision that we can. Then we take our goods and get them actually also out to the customers by packaging them and distributing them in the best possible way. And also here we can have an influence. Okay, where do we do our goods and how do we then get these to the customers in the best possible way that is not only good for climate, but also for biodiversity. And of course, then we inspire and sell and we meet a customer. And we can also there, of course, nudge a customer behavior to also see how can they be more knowledgeable in this journey in their conscious choices of what they want to consume, but also to prolong the life of all of our products, so that really we have this circular business model in our mind in the circular society, that we reuse, we refurbish, we remanufacture. At the last end, we only recycle. So we also think that that is an important part when we talk about nature, to actually release as much pressure as we can from taking out resources. We say already today in our sustainability strategy that we don't have a nature strategy per se, but we inject it there. We are saying when it comes to nature, that we want to regenerate more resources than what we actually take out, to protect ecosystems, improve biodiversity, and also when it comes to water, to be good water stewards. So if we look into the next slide, so this is our wheel, and I can say that what in then responsibility that I'm having here is it does go across the entire value chain. We need to work together with all of many different IKEAs out there to make this happen. So our approach to nature, if we look into biodiversity first, this is a strategic topic for IKEA. And we have added that now into our portfolio of strategic topics, where of course climate has been one for a long time, fair and equal has been equally so. Healthy and safe, health and sustainable living, and also circularity. Now we have biodiversity and land use. We have water, and we also added air pollution. So it's a strategic topic for us. We are now building our agenda in a science-based way by working with SBTN's methodology, and we are part of the corporate engagement program now. So also giving input and securing that the methodology will work well for us. This is a big work. And it, of course, also it has been a little bit delayed, as I think most of you know. So we have to now go into the land, the water, and then hopefully soon also into biodiversity and the ocean part. So this is important for us to really build the science-based also then strategy, actually. We are already today shaping certification schemes in our discussions with them, those where we are part, or maybe those where we want to be part, to secure that they always, also push actually and advance the ambitions here, and to secure that we can have credible verification schemes that gives proof points for us that we are doing the right things, and not to think that any scheme is, perfect. You need to work with them all the time. For instance, with FSC, that is very important for us, since 60% of IKEA products comes from wood-based materials. We have initiated together with many other players also the fast tracking of biodiversity into the FSC standard. And we bring it, of course, into our internal requirements. We have a supply code of conduct. There we put expectations on our suppliers to actually take consideration of biodiversity into their way of working. So we spread this responsibility out to all, but we put them the demands and we will follow up about that. We have been since 20 years having a partnership with WWF that is, of course, all about enhancing biodiversity. So we have a lot of learnings from on the ground work across the globe that we can also scale up. And then, of course, to influence the global frameworks, like now we have the GBF, and we were part of also talking about make it mandatory. We were there lending our voice because we're a big brand. We have a big responsibility, and we can also help to shape the future. If we then look on water, equal, as I said before, also a strategic topic for us. We use a lot of water in our supply chain. We have been mapping it. So we know approximately where it is, but we need to go even deeper now into the facts, as what you said also, Tim, to get to know where of course, the impact lies. Probably, and both biodiversity and water, I mean, the impacts across the value chain, I think they will look quite similar to what they do for climate, where the further back you go in the value chain, the more you find in the raw material growing and so on. Of course, here is very evident with water. So we're working with all those kind of things with more crop for every drop, etc., in the materials that we use a lot. Also here, building then the science-based agenda, and here we are now in the process of setting contextual targets where we are then present in the most water-scarce areas, where we have our production units to secure we put even tougher demands on them than maybe where we have a less problem in this area. So here we put contextual targets, and we're doing that also with some support from WWF. And also here developing best practices on the ground through this long-term partnership with the WWF then. It's also very important for us that we can, since we have what I showed before, we can actually meet the customers in their homes. Of course, when it comes to water, it's to have solutions that can help the customers to save water in their own homes. Not on this slide is, of course, also the things that are also part of nature, such as inorganics. And we also then have responsible sourcing practices, for instance, for the inorganic material, specifically for IKEA, that takes in the consideration of people and the nature and also climate in some parts. So this is a bit the approach that we have, and what we want to now do is to integrate this into all of our strategies, not only sustainability, or if we would even call it a nature strategy going forward. We have a supply strategy, that's where the choices need to be made. We have a range and communication strategy that is very important for us to take it there, and the meeting the customer strategy. And also people strategy for us as co-workers, how do we also use the nature as something to create more employer branding, have the co-workers staying with us, because they can also trust that we're trying to do our best here. But this is complex. It's a very broad scope that we have, because we have so many different materials in our supply chain, our products. And of course, our assets also in infrastructure is everything from stores to warehouses to offices and so on. So we need to also secure nature in that aspect, not only in the material that I maybe tend to talk a lot about here, but also, as you know, securing that we can not go to the totally concrete area when it comes to a warehouse facility, for instance, that how can we also secure that we have biodiversity there and help us then to protect towards flooding and droughts, etc. So we have to have a very multifaceted agenda, and that is what we're trying to build here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. Really appreciate those perspectives. And again, do welcome questions in the Q&A box for Christina and the other panelists for the next part of the webinar. Introducing next Marcelo Behar from Natura&Co. If we can move to the next slide, thank you, who is Vice President of Sustainability and Group Affairs. Marcelo, over to you. Thank you so much. If we can add Marcelo, there we go. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mairead. Thank you so much, team. It's my honor and privilege to be with amazing speakers and with Salesforce on this webinar. You've been leading the way here on nature, and many discussions have been hosted by Salesforce. I don't know if everyone knows Natura&Co quite well. We are a Brazilian company based in São Paulo. Natura was born 50 years ago and founded back in 1969. we started as a store, cosmetic company, and the business turned into nature when the first COP occurred back in 1992. It was the Earth Conference in Rio de Janeiro, and it was the first COP. It was when the COP for climate, for biodiversity, were together, were only one. And the founders of Natura, 3 entrepreneurs, they thought, well, what can we build and how can we bring the Amazon into everything we do? And they started to shift the business towards connecting every product with the biodiversity in Brazil. And we formed a group with other companies that probably are well known by many of those who are listening to us today, like The Body Shop, like Avon, and we are together, we call group Natura&Co. And we put together a sustainability vision 4 years ago, and that's the slide that I'm first presenting to you, which connects the 3 main pillars and how we address the main issues of our time. So the first one is to address the climate crisis and to protect the Amazon. As we are Brazilian-based, we see our work with the Amazon that has been consistently ongoing for the last 20 years with traditional communities as the main stronghold of the business model of Natura&Co, and I'll deep dive on this. The second one is to defend human rights and to be humankind. And I think business do have to be more vocal about it. Natura&Co has finally achieved 50% of women in roles of leadership and achieved full gender pay in equal roles for every organization, every country where we operate. Nowadays, we are in 100 countries with very different realities. We also have targets for living wage for our employees to keep on paying above living wage from here on. On supply chains, we do have specific targets. And finally, the third pillar is to embrace circularity and regeneration for packaging, formulation, and something that connects to nature as well, which are the investments on regenerative solutions. I'd like to move to the next slide, just to double click on the slides on climate, how we see the connection between the climate crisis and protecting nature. So first of all, I'd like to say that operating on the space of ESG, sustainability, corporate responsibility for almost 20 years, I think we have many acronyms, and you heard a few of them today, and you'll be hearing a few more, which is important because they create the frameworks where we can understand how business can be comparable and how they are performing, especially against new targets. Our view is that for carbon emissions, we set interesting targets, and those who are already agreed on science via IPCC, the scientific panel, those who are agreed for countries on the Paris Agreement. Everyone knows where the NDCs, the national contributions are. We have agreed on science-based targets, how to curve absolute emissions, and we have agreed on TCFD, how can we bring nature into finance and how can we connect risk on climate into finance. Now we have to give this exactly the same discipline for nature. So we are trying to connect those dots, creating a scope of work that will help IPBS to set the baseline as we have for carbon, the same for nature, that will help the countries with their NBSEPs, which is the national strategies for nature. Those should be somehow connected to what companies are doing, and they are not nowadays yet. So that's something important. Natura&Co is also pioneering with science-based targets for nature, SBTN, which will be an important instrument of measurement. And as referred to by Tim, we are one of the task force members of TNFD as well, connecting nature to finance. Once those disciplines are in place, I think it will be easier for everyone to track progress, to know where companies are, and to compare what companies are doing vis-a-vis what science tells that should be done and what countries should be improving. What we are doing in our case is mostly connecting the climate agenda with the nature agenda. Reason why we are expanding the protection of the Amazon. Nowadays, we operate with 39 Amazonian communities, around 10,000 people. We're going to expand this to 45 Amazonian communities, moving from 2 million hectares that our operation currently protect into 3 million hectares of coverage, which is half of the size of Holland. It's not big. For the Amazon, it's a very small part. So we do need a lot of help and many others to join on that same front, so we can reverse and halt nature loss sooner rather than later. Besides that, I think what is really important is how we operate with the ingredients and how we decommoditize the bio-ingredients. And I think learning how to bring new elements into what we produce and we do will help us to work with traditional communities. And as you know, 80% of the world biodiversity is on the hands of traditional communities. So we do really have to understand how we operate with them on a way that is at the same time healthy for them, that will create development for them in a non-patronizing way, in a way that take into consideration what they want to develop, how they want to develop. So Natura is probably one of the companies that has anthropologists and social sciences working with traditional communities, so we can understand better how can we develop their way of living in a way that we do not create what is called a Dutch disease, right? So we don't harm their way of living, and we improve their way of living while we produce better. And we respect the cycles of nature, which is something different as well. So we have to learn how not only to follow the commercial cycles, but also follow the nature cycles. Just to give you one very practical example on the next slide, please. This is a picture that was taken a month ago. I was there in Abaetetuba, Brazil. So I took, Tim referred to the TNFD framework. And you can see the TNFD CEO on my left, which was the first time that he visited the Amazon. So I told him, Tony, you got to come and see and understand what we are referring to and what we are talking about. So getting less theoretical and more practical. So that island in Abaetetuba used to be an island that produced sugarcane. It was monoculture, fertilizers, pesticides. It was poor, and it produced sugarcane for a small mill that broken, and the mill could not purchase the sugarcane anymore, so the land was abandoned. And the community nearby said, let's regenerate the land and let's bring the forest back so we can take from the forest. So they started to regenerate it 25 years ago. And one of the trees, that tree that you see in the middle of the picture, is a tree called Ukuuba. And Ukuuba tree used to be chopped down, so we would produce broomsticks and roofs in the southern parts of Brazil. For the wood, the community would get around 50 reais. So that's not a lot. And Natura was operating with that community, purchasing castanha and other elements from the Brazilian biodiversity. And we said, what if we understand if we could work also with the fruits and seeds from the Ukuuba tree, so the community would stop chopping and would start planting it. And we understood that we could develop a whole line of products out of Ukuuba with a very high hydrating power. And we did that 5 years ago. And now we are able to pay 3 times more for half of the seeds of that tree than what the community would get for the wood of that tree. So the community immediately stopped chopping and start planting. That's how nature-based solutions should work. That's a very practical example. If TNFD is able to develop a methodology that will incentivize the opportunities and not only show the risks, I think we'll be able to sponsor and to foster new possibilities of business out of the forest. So that's the example I'd like to give to you. And thank you so much. Open to your questions.
Thank you so much, Marcelo, for sharing that. And it's a great story of the Ukuuba as well. Moving on to our final panelist before we move into interactive Q&A, and that is Marissa McGowan, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer for North America from L'Oreal. Marissa, welcoming you, and over to you.
Thanks so much. All right, if we could advance to the next slide, please. So similar to what you heard from Christina, we look at nature through the lens of our entire sustainability strategy. So at L'Oreal, we have 3 what we call highways to achieving our goals. That's really working on ourselves, our internal business process, and keeping our business activities within the bounds of the planetary boundaries. We talk about empowering our business ecosystem. So on the side, you'll see, like everybody else, working with suppliers, working with our brands, working with our retailers and our consumers. And then finally, contributing to some of the most urgent challenges that we see facing our world today from a social and environmental perspective. And that's where some of our funds come in. So we'll talk about all of those a bit later. But similar to what you've heard, everything we do is based on science, and it's informed through the concept of planetary boundaries. So how do we grow our business while respecting the limits that our planet can take to both house us and keep providing all the resources that make us able to make all the beautiful things that we make. So we took that approach with climate, but we also took it to apply to our other goals around water management, biodiversity, and resource management. In a few of the actual commitments that I think bring to life how we're thinking about nature include the use of our wastewater. So making sure that all of our industrial facilities recycle and reuse their wastewater in a full loop by 2030. Now, just to give you some example that could be meaningful if you have a lot of production. So here in the US, 80% of what we sell is actually manufactured by us here in the US. So when we talk about managing our wastewater, it does have a larger impact than if we were talking about owned and operated, but we had a very large contract manufactured supply chain. We want to limit our impact on natural habitat. So we committed to a hold flat on our land use, so total land occupancy by 2030 against a 2019 baseline. We also talked about a positive impact on biodiversity at all of our sites. So just recently, we've undergone 17 biodiversity assessments or intakes here in North America. If we think about empowering our business ecosystem, an example that we have here is our brands using their platform. So our Yves Saint Laurent beauty brand has committed to 100,000 hectare restoration or bringing the wild back, working together with Rewild. And that's a consumer-facing campaign that has gotten a lot of traction. And in terms of solving the most urgent challenges, one of our funds, which I'll talk a little bit more about, is particularly dedicated to the regeneration of our ecosystems. If you could go to the next slide, please. Similar to what you heard from Christina and Marcelo, so much of what comes through in terms of our efforts comes through our formulations. So at L'Oreal, we use over 1,700 raw materials and those come from about over 300 botanical species. So how we think about sourcing those materials has a large impact on our nature strategy and approach. So what you'll see here is we're looking at bio-based ingredients derived from abundant minerals or from circular processes. So not just having the bio-based piece, but also making sure that that is coming from a source that is regenerative or we're not depleting the resource. Also 100% of our bio-based ingredients being traceable and sustainably sourced. In terms of these commitments, we're at about 60% for the first one and 90% at the second one, but we're continuing to work hard on these. You see the land occupancy piece as well as the eco design and formulations being respectful of aquatic ecosystems. So all of these pieces of the puzzle, when we think about our research and innovation, we're constantly working towards these 100% or 95% goals. Thought it may be fun to show 3 product launches that happened in 2022 with a few of our brands where we're very proud about the efforts they made towards the bio-based and biodegradability commitments we've made. So you see Thayer's on the side there, Cahill's Midnight Recovery. If you love that cream, you can also feel great about what they've done in terms of the reformulations towards 96% bio-based and 97% biodegradable ingredients. And then on the far right, you see our Biolage brand also on the conditioning cream. So each, we do track this, and each reformulation needs to show an improvement against these commitments as well as others that we've made. Next slide, please. Finally, as I discussed before, we believe that we have a lot of work to do on ourselves. We have a lot of influence we can have on our business ecosystem, but we also believe that our commitment and responsibility goes beyond that. So we have committed to restoring 1 million hectares of degraded ecosystems. We've created a 50 million euro fund, and we are very committed to not just as you heard from the others, not just the land restoration, but also the investment in the local community. So this fund is very much putting people back at the center of the story, whether that's your commitment to climate or your commitment to nature, making sure people are at the center of it. So this fund really looks at that intersectionality. And we just wanted to highlight one example here, which is restoration of mangroves in Kenya. As we know, mangroves are certainly our friends when it comes to the climate. This also has a very positive people story. And in the interest of time, I'm happy to talk more about it, but hopefully you see through the lenses of what we're trying to do internally, what we're trying to do with our customers, consumers, and suppliers, and then finally how we're trying to contribute through the fund and putting to use those dollars to improve ecosystems and communities, that we are trying very hard to work on this nature piece, and thrilled to be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Really appreciate that. And it's great to have seen that fund launch. If we now move straight into our Q&A, and we'll take the slides down now, and we'll have all the panelists together. That's fantastic. If we can be pinned together, that would be great. Here we are. So we're now going to move into an interactive Q&A. It's been some great questions coming through as we've gone through the course of the webinar so far. I think I'll direct the first one to Tim, if that's okay with you, Tim, which is how do we deal with the growing anti-ESG sentiment in the US and those folks saying we are pushing a liberal agenda?
For those of us working for global companies, it can seem that we live in parallel worlds, because in the EU, clearly with the Green Deal, biodiversity is now on every large corporate's agenda. It's been put there by the legislator. And in the US, we're still waiting for the SEC ruling on climate. And some states have issued some very progressive legislation. Let's also not forget that there are many cities that take a lot of action on nature and biodiversity, probably including the city where you have offices. So not everything is about federal regulation, but clearly for us so far, we have not seen a direct impact in terms of Salesforce's investments, but we have gotten that question from a lot of our American customers. We do see that there's still an increase in nature-based investments, both as a risk mitigation measure for resilience and staff engagement. Investors are starting to ask, and as an opportunity. So far, we've not really seen that anti-ESG rhetoric stall the interest in nature, but we're keeping a close eye on it. In the long term, this is, of course, until the 5th of November, 2024, going to play out at least. But in the long term, the market signal, the policy signal, the science are all very clear. They all point to more corporate, more public, more civil society action on nature. So this is what we're getting ready for. And every business we speak with, they acknowledge that, and they're also getting ready for it.
I'm happy to jump in there too, as someone based here in the US. We're getting this question a lot too, but I think it's less from the people I would expect to hear it from, and maybe a little bit more from those I wouldn't expect to hear it from. So our answer is consistently the purpose, the mission, the strategy. If you believe in all of those, nothing changes. We've talked about, if you want to be thoughtful towards different audiences and talk more about better business, efficiency, long-term value, and the like, maybe that's more appropriate. But for us, nothing changes. The work doesn't change because it's built into what we believe is necessary for long-term value for our stakeholders. So, I just wanted to put a little exclamation point on that.
That's a very useful. Yeah.
If I may, I was in New York Climate Week last week, 2 weeks ago, right? And I heard this sentence, which I think resumes quite well the issue. It's not an issue of politics. It's an issue of mathematics, physics, and biology, period, right?
Useful builds. Thank you both for that. Moving on to another question that we received, which perhaps Christina, from a supply chain perspective, you'd be curious to respond to, is a question that came through around how to balance simultaneous delivery of climate and nature goals with your suppliers. Do you struggle with supplier fatigue due to too many asks and demands?
It's a very relevant question, of course, and I think that how we want to see it and tend to see it is that, you know, talking about climate, nature, and people, actually three things that goes well together, and to actually build on the interconnectedness of this. So we also need to be mindful when we come with our new asks, plans out to our suppliers, that we see what can we do that actually can also target more than one of the three. So that's the way to do it. So we need to also sequence, you know, what we ask from our suppliers and the entire supply chain that we have. So of course we also use a risk-based approach. So we don't go one claim to all. We do it where we actually need to. And those suppliers who are in, for instance, if it would be the water scarce areas, they would also understand why they would need to do this. Of course, because they are actually living in that area, so they are also hit by it. And also, if we would have with the biodiversity loss, also there, of course, people do see it as well. So I think that people do understand it. I would say it's more actually on our own team side, because the teams are asked to do a lot of work, and they do it also globally. So that we need to secure that it's possible for them to do this. So we believe that the sequencing of activities, looking at the interdependence of the topics, will actually make it possible for us to come with also the tougher demands where we really need to get the movement. And we try to work in that way, risk-based, and think about interdependencies and have the sequencing that actually makes sense and that can move the agendas, of course, because everybody needs to work on this. And I think in one way, for the nature part, it's almost easier to understand because you see it around you. It's local, whilst climate is invisible. So in that sense, once we get the narrative right, I do believe that we can also get both our teams and our suppliers with us. You know, they have also joined to work with IKEA because they believe in to create a better everyday life for the many people.
Thank you, Christina. And moving on to a couple more questions, because there's a few and conscious of the time. So actually, Marcelo, perhaps this is one that you would be curious or keen to respond to. And it's from someone who says, agree with the comments around biggest impact sitting deeper in the supply chain. How are the panelists approaching improving traceability in supply chains and tackling challenges on leverage to drive change when working with producers who can be several tiers of supply chain away from your business? So essentially, any insights around how you're thinking about managing the impacts in supply chain, particularly when they're slightly more you. Thanks, Marcelo.
Yeah, so I think that's a crucial question. And normally what we say when we have events like this is to enforce the importance of reviewing our supply chains, to have a third-party verification, which is fundamental. And I think we have to be more and more accurate and more on the top of everything we do, knowing traceability from inside out. But I would like to stress another perspective as well, which is, I think the work that Natura has put in place for the last 30 years was to work with nature, trying to create business possibilities out of environmental and social challenges. So instead of moving away from where you see that might come a problem, it's for companies to understand what the problem is about and to use business as a force to transform the problem into new possibilities and to bring supply chain to where it could and should be. I think what we see and how we understand, especially European legislation, that it's now moving to enforce more rigorous criteria, it can go both ways. On one side, it can guarantee that companies are under compliance with legislation, which is fundamental. But it can also move away companies from working to reverse the problems of the supply chain and closing their eyes and saying, oh, I'm going in another direction. I'm not even going to bother with that problem. So I think there is another dimension that it's rarely mentioned on the supply chain issue, which is how to transform the problems and not to be afraid of them. That would be my strong recommendation and contribution to the debate.
That's brilliant. Yeah. That's a good quote there, Marcelo, at the end. What I would then say is sort of trying to weave through these different questions quite quickly, but Marissa, there's an interesting question here for L'Oreal around, and they say, talking about nature and the clock ticking, we know that we need to collaborate on what works quickly to get results. In the case of L'Oreal, for example, how do you balance this collaborative approach while also protecting shareholder value?
So the quick answer is we don't see them as mutually exclusive. As long as we're operating within, competition law, we try to collaborate as much as possible, whether that's collaboration with peers, retailers, suppliers, government. Honestly, the degree of humility that we have to approach the situation with, I think, is large, because none of this can be done alone. And so maybe just a few examples. I think the reason we started with Transform ourselves is because it's such a big piece of when we come to the table with a partner, we want to know that we did the work ourselves, whatever we're asking of them, right? So if we're asking our suppliers to decarbonize, that we've done everything we can to reduce our emissions and, bring renewable sources of energy into our value chain. So my quick answer is I think we have to use partners everywhere we can, and if anything, it should be an accelerant. This is an area where all boats rise. That said, around things like formulations, you could have a formulation that is part of your intellectual property. That doesn't mean that working on an input like palm oil shouldn't be done through a collective like the Responsible Palm Oil Network. So I think there's if I'm understanding the question correctly, I would say we need more partnership, not less. And as long as we're operating within the bounds of anti-competition law, we're pretty keen to do it.
Thank you, Marissa. That's really helpful. There's a fair few other questions that I think we're going to touch on in the closing notes, actually. So I think we'll have just one final piece on, let's see, the piece I think around which I think I'll pass to you, Tim, on, around the sort of any key reflections on biodiversity and nature credits. And what your current thinking is on that.
So we purchase some high quality nature-based solution carbon credits. At the moment, we want to see carbon credits that have high biodiversity, high social benefits, and those are available in the market. We're not planning yet to buy nature credits, but we're following this market very closely, as are many of us, I'm sure, including developments in Australia, where this is probably going to be legislated, and many other jurisdictions that already have habitat banking in place. I very quickly see another question that I couldn't resist, Mairead, if you allow. Are biodiversity metrics sustainability reporting completely independent from business or company's financial accounting statements? I think the role of the chief sustainability officer is also shifting, or there has to be more collaboration with the chief finance officer, with the reporting and compliance team, as we see this big shift from voluntary to compliance. And Marissa, Christina, Marcelo, you all know that that inter-company collaboration, where at some point something becomes a compliance and then it is dealt with by a team that is set up to do that. And having nature placed there, just like we're doing with climate, is an ongoing shift. But it's clear that we have to understand that these biodiversity metrics and sustainability reporting is not just is not independent from the company's financial or accounting statements much longer as we move into regulation. So this is part of getting ready for nature.
Really helpful. Thank you, Tim, for that. And thank you for all the great questions and also some of the comments we've seen in chat. We are coming up to the hour, so we will close with a couple of final reflections. If Vaishnavi, we can add the slides back up, but keep all the panelists spotlighted as well. That would be lovely. Thank you. So I guess lots of reflections from this webinar. If we were to share a few of the top tips as you navigate your nature strategy, recognizing that on the call today, we'll have businesses of different sizes, different geographies, different sectors, and different stages of their strategy. I think some overarching principles we would share to bear in mind, and I think this also covers some of the questions I saw that we didn't quite get to, is to take it fundamentally an integrated approach. Rather than seeing nature in a silo, it's really approaching nature as part of an integrated strategy with your climate strategy and your broader business strategy. Secondly, if it is a complex space, it is more complex than carbon and climate, and therefore start by understanding and reducing your most significant impacts while in parallel working to try and understand the full picture of your total risks, the dependencies and impacts on nature that allows you to get on the front foot and having the most material impact you can within your business. The third is to actually really explore opportunities for value creation. This isn't just a risk impact management job. This is about how, as a business, as a commercial brand, we can be creative about exploring opportunities to create value anchored in your superpowers, anchored on what makes you exceptional, what you bring best to the table. And that also allows for focus and greatest impact. Fourth, I think we've touched on this a little bit, but that opportunity to consider nature investments, which is still very much a growing space, that are more deeply connected to your business, to your supply chain, who you are, where you operate, rather than more of a transactional carbon credit type approach. This is something that nature offers in a really interesting way. Fifth is to place people at the heart of the strategy. After all, people are nature too. It's not separate. And therefore anchoring the strategy in people. That's people that are within the value chain, teams, the local communities where you operate, allows for a really integrated and powerful approach. And lastly, of course, don't wait for the perfect metrics, data and regulation. It's coming, but start now. It allows you to get ahead. And then I'll just add finally that communication is really important. Ultimately, that is the tool through which you're connecting with all of your communities, teams, people, customers, investors, stakeholders, and therefore how. It's not just what strategy you create, it's also how you communicate and engage others. And then the very final slide, which you will see because you'll get a recording of this, so we won't overlabor it, but Vaish, if you can add the next slide, just some useful resources. Oh, sorry, there we go. Some useful resources. A lot of them will be familiar to everyone on this call, but some of them are more recent, like the sector guidance that came out just last week from WBCSD, WEF and Business for Nature. And we would also point to some useful publicly accessible documents from Salesforce, the Nature Positive Strategy and the Nature Policy Priorities, and of course those from the panelists today as well. And then a final shout out for our next episode, as we're almost getting to the hour, and we will share those links, of course, in the follow-up note that you'll receive, is just to thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to the almost 150 attendees that we had through the course of this webinar. And we would love to invite you to our second episode, which is about mobilizing the C-suite behind nature. What's the real business case, which actually also was some questions we received in the Q&A. And you can use this QR code now to sign up if you would be keen. And we'll also share the link to that in the follow-up note. And if you have any questions or would like to discuss this further, there's also my contact detail there that I've shared.